Good afternoon and welcome to the 183rd of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today we have a discussion of Scandinavia in the pandemic with Leonor Borgesius, Eric Isberg, Nalan Azak, Emil Flato, and Lori Peak. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @USofDisaster or @COVID Calls. Please help spread the word and send suggestions for guests and future topics. Please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, December 8th, 2020, there are 1,552,369 deaths from COVID-19 globally, according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. There are 15,019,092 cases in the United States. There are now a total of 284,887 deaths from COVID-19 reported in the United States. That's up from 283,010 reported yesterday. Some additional perspective, there have been 359 deaths reported in Norway and 7,200 deaths reported from COVID-19 in Sweden. As a way to bring some humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is, "A Child's Death in the Heartland Changes Community Views About COVID." This was written by Sarah Shipley Hiles, published today, December 8th, by the Kaiser Health News. The dateline is Washington, Missouri. In August, local officials in this small city an hour west of St. Louis voted against requiring residents to wear masks to prevent the spread of the coronavirus. On November 23rd, with COVID cases surging and the local hospital overflowing, the city council brought a mask order back for another vote. As protesters marched outside, Councilman Nick Obermark, an electrician, was the sole member of the nonpartisan council to change his vote, causing the mandate to pass. One of his many reasons? He has a child the same age as Washington middle school student Peyton Baumgarth, 13, who on Halloween became the youngest person in Missouri to die of COVID complications. "That hit pretty hard," Obermark said later. "Though the councilman doesn't like wearing a mask, he said it's worth it if we can keep one or two people from getting COVID-19. Washington, Missouri became the latest community to flip its stance on masks and other restrictions while the coronavirus ravages the country. As America enters a dark winter without national directives to curb the pandemic, numerous cities, counties, and states must decide: enact more restrictions now or leave people to their own will. Some in this tight-knit city of 14,000 have discovered that the answer, and the key to changing hearts and minds, lies in how close and real the danger seems. After a spate of nursing home fatalities early on in Franklin County, where Washington is located, 2 months this summer passed without a death from COVID. Some residents saw the virus as a big city problem and rejected preventive measures. Families attended weddings with hundreds of guests. Downtown merchants held Thirsty Thursday, with participants mingling over drinks. Even as officials at the city's hospital urged COVID restrictions, 356 people signed a letter to the local paper vowing their opposition to being forced to cover our mouths in public. Republican Missouri Governor Mike Parson has declined to enact a statewide mask mandate. Franklin County Presiding County Commissioner Tim Brinker posted on Twitter on July 29th, quote, "Franklin County, Missouri, no mandates, low case counts, low to no hospitalizations. Logic, exclamation point. Keep hands clean, and if you don't have the space, cover your face. We love freedom and respect human life. Come to Franklin County and raise your children in God's country. Hashtag COVID," unquote. In the months before the election, yards sprouted signs for President Donald Trump, who has downplayed the threat of COVID-19 since the start of the pandemic. But the virus crept closer in September when 74-year-old Ralph Struckhoff died of the disease. The Missourian newspaper published a story describing him as a healthy man who had just done a day of construction work at his church before he fell ill. Please wear a mask in honor of Ralph, in memory of Ralph, his widow, Jane Struckhoff, wrote in a letter to the editor. If this virus can take Ralph, it can take down anyone. In November, Mayor Sandy Lucy noticed that attitudes were evolving. That's when residents heard about Peyton, the middle schooler who declined rapidly and died days after being admitted to the hospital, his mother told KMOV. According to his obituary, he was known for his love of Pokemon Go, flag football, and the St. Louis Blues. He loved his puppies, Yachty and Louie, who would be lost without their buddy. It said he loved listening to music and singing in the school choir. Suddenly, there was a death of a 13-year-old, Lucy said, and you think maybe this virus is more vicious than I give it credit for being. Peyton's mother, Stephanie Franek, pleaded in a TV interview, wear a mask when you're in public, wash your hands, and know that COVID is real. Meanwhile, cases skyrocketed. Between the first and the second mask votes, the total COVID count in Franklin County, with a population around 104,000, climbed from 728 to 4,594, and deaths rose from 19 to 75. In the week ending November 23rd, 25% of COVID tests returned positive results. Mercy Hospital, Washington, was running out of space. Hospital President Eric Eloff tied rising hospitalizations and deaths to the absence of safety measures. As a hospital administrator, I knew we would be on the receiving end of the choices not to wear the masks and not to social distance, he said. In a surprise move, November 19th, the Franklin County Board of Commissioners enacted a mandatory mask order. Presiding Commissioner Brinker told the Missourian that he had spoken to local doctors and the St. Louis Regional Pandemic Task Force, and the numbers speak for themselves. Brinker did not respond to requests for comment for this story. Although the order already applied to the city, the Washington City Council went further and approved its own mask rule 4 days later. Unlike the county order, which expires December 20th, the city's mandate will stay in force based on metrics related to the new COVID cases, the new COVID case rate, hospital admissions, and deaths. Dozens of protesters wielded flags and signs against mandatory masking outside City Hall the evening of the vote. Allie and Duncan Whittington came with their 4-year-old daughter. I'm here because I feel my freedom is being violated, Allie Whittington said. Councilman Obermark later said that he had lost a lot of sleep over his decision. It wasn't one thing, he said. It was several things that made me change my mind. The high positivity rate, the lack of capacity at the hospital, knowing healthy people whom COVID knocked down for days, his wife having to quarantine, and Peyton's death. He said he knew that masks aren't a cure-all, but that they could help reduce the spread until vaccines arrive. We tried nothing and it isn't working, he said, so we have to try something. Okay, let me bring Lori Peek in, a great friend of COVID Calls and a frequent guest. Lori, it's great to see you.
You too, and Scott, that was that story of Peyton and of that entire town. That was very moving and what a cautionary tale for us all. There are 111 kids have now died in the United States due to COVID, and Peyton is one of them.
We're seeing more of these stories of teenagers.
Yeah, that was really moving. Washington, Missouri is about 5 hours from where my parents' farm is. And, just the whole midsection of the country is just surging. And so thank you for that opening, as always, moving and so important for us to hear.
Well, I'm glad to see you, as always. And for those who don't know you, you can check out all of Lori's work. I just want to identify her as the director of the Natural Hazard Center at the University of Colorado Boulder, and Lori's a sociologist who works on disasters and children in disaster, among many, many other things. And she's also an organizer of research, and that's what brings you on today, right?
Yes. So thank you for having me to talk about this 1,000 Letters project.
Okay, so we are in this very weird period, which people usually are playing a parlor game where they're trying to decide who's going to be the agriculture secretary. And instead, right now, we're wondering uh, where's the leadership that's going to get us through to January 20th as we have a transition to a new presidential administration? And you've kind of encouraged the research community to step into that gap a little bit and take action. Tell us what you've got in
Yes.
mind, Lori.
Yeah, so about a week and a half ago, I guess, we released this call for the 1,000 Letters Project. And this is really an initiative that is in response in some ways to President-elect Biden's 4 major priority areas, which he has already clearly named. They're on the transition website. And those 4 priority areas are COVID-19, climate change, economic recovery, and racial justice. And those 4 areas really they cross-cut what so many in this hazards and disaster research and practice community do. And so we released this call. We're trying to collect 1,000 letters from the members of the hazards and disaster community so that we can uplift our collective voices, we can show ourselves as a community, and I hope we can contribute during this time of transition to these 4 major policy priorities, but also just more generally sharing our collective knowledge and wisdom, what we know, what we think needs to be done, what we think needs to be restored or created in the emergency management and the hazards and disaster research and mitigation space.
I'm just going to put these 4 themes up: COVID-19, climate change, economic recovery, and racial justice. I wonder, some people might be surprised that disaster researchers are engaged in particularly number 3 and 4 on that list, economic recovery and racial justice. Can you say a little bit about the complexity of this disaster as it relates to those 4 themes, Lori?
Yes, absolutely. And, I think you're right that COVID-19, clearly a global catastrophe. Obviously, the community has risen up in response to this, and COVID calls has highlighted that so beautifully. So COVID-19 and climate change, and especially the extreme events associated with climate change that are really the primary symptoms of a sick planet. Those first 2 priority areas, you're right. I think it's yes, of course, the hazards and disaster community would want to respond. But to the other 2 areas, economic recovery has actually been a focal area of study since even some of the earliest field research studies, as you have written about so eloquently, some of the earliest researchers in the late 1940s and early 1950s, economic recovery and business interruption were some of the focal areas of some of those earliest studies. And to date, we have several leading economists and other researchers who really look at business recovery in the context of disaster. So that's a clear, we have things to say about that. And then in terms of racial justice, something that I'm so proud of, where scholarship in the hazards and disaster field has really gone over the decades, is really this recognition that disasters aren't discrete events that are acts of God that come out of nowhere. They're really rooted in societal injustices and inequalities that turn natural hazards into disasters. And so an understanding of injustice and hence possibilities for justice has really become fundamental, I think, to a lot of the disaster research and even the practice enterprise. And so plenty to say there as well.
I wonder if you could say just a little bit about the logistics of this, and I'm gonna put the link up and we'll tweet the link out so that people can find this call for the letters. But, are you looking for a manifesto here? How many? Because I've got one if you want to take it, but maybe people don't always have as much time to write as I do. What are you looking for?
Right. Yes. So we have put a 500-word limit on this, and last night I received a very sweet email saying, "Dear Miss Peak, I am so sorry, but my letter is 588 words. I hope you will still accept it," which I gladly did. But we really capped this at 500 words due by December 15th. And the 500 words is for a reason, because we know it's sometimes hard enough to get people to read 50 words these days. And so 500 words to keep these succinct, sort of what is the key point to the letter. So 500-word limit is what we're asking for, but then the sky is the limit from there. while there are the 4 priority areas that the transition team has named as part of the presidential transition, really more broadly, the request is, again, what is it that you think, what investments need to be made in the workforce in the future of hazards and disaster research and emergency management? And so some of the letters we've received have really used their 500 words to hone in on one or more of those policy priority areas. Others have been much more general about sort of the state of emergency management and hazards and disaster research. So 500 words, please write a letter, send it to us. I am reading every single letter as it comes in. And then I've set up a database for the letters where I'm tracking the key themes that are coming through because, well, I think 1,000 letters has a real power and a punch to it. We also know that those in charge are probably going to want that high-level memo to start out with to see what are the key points and the themes and what is this community wanting to see moving forward. So there'll be a high-level synthesis and then the stack of letters.
You know, as you were talking, I just now realized I should have thought of this from the beginning. You're also creating an archive of the priority areas for the research community in this very interesting space that we're in before the inauguration. I'm sure you thought of that in your sleep 6 months ago, and it just now occurred to me that this is what you're doing.
Well, Scott, right back at you. I mean, every time I listen to COVID calls, and every time when I tell people about what this is about, I say, he is a historian who is building an oral history archive in real time. And you're absolutely right. When issuing this call, one of the things I'm always struck by when I listen to the show, when I'm on a webinar with members of our community, when I'm in a meeting in the old days when we were together in a room, I was always just so struck by there's never enough time. Everybody has something to say that matters. Everyone has a history, experiences, ideas, but oftentimes our frameworks, an hour-and-a-half session, an hour webinar, they don't always allow for all of the voices to be heard. And so you're right, I'm hoping that this 1,000 letters, that it really can serve as a sort of archive. And I actually say that in the call that after these are all assembled for privately sharing with the transition team, then I'm going to circle back with the authors and see if they'd be willing to allow them to be a part of the 1,000 letters project page archive on the Hazard Center website.
That's tremendous. I mean, think if we had done this in 2008, reflecting on Hurricane Katrina, or if we had done this, well, basically any time there's a transition of power. I want to ask a question, though, that you probably will anticipate. I sometimes hear, not only from emergency managers, but sometimes from them, but also from social scientists and humanists, can't we just stay out of the politics? Why responding to disasters, helping people in need, that we shouldn't be engaged in the politics, because then that seems like we're choosing sides. It shows bias. What's your reaction to that?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. And you know what, if I would have been the director of the Natural Hazard Center in 2016, I hope that I would have had the idea. I can't say, but I wasn't the director in 2016. But you know what, if in 2024 we elect a Republican or a Democrat president in 2024, then I hope we could go through this same exercise together as a community. So one thing I want to say is this definitely isn't just about that it's a Democratic administration coming in. I hope we would do this anytime. And I have to say, I don't fully see this as a political act. Instead, I see it as political leaders are setting an agenda that our community holds a lot of expertise in. And so if we can lend that expertise, isn't that our duty as citizens and scholars? And the final thing I'll say that actually was part of what sparked me to do this is we received a call at the University of Colorado Boulder, and I bet a lot of your other listeners who are at universities may have received a similar request. So through our government affairs office, they actually sent out a request to institute and center directors naming the policy priorities, and then they asked for names of people who we would recommend for political appointments, but also people who hold expertise. And I was so inspired by that because I thought, here is a presidential administration reaching out to a Research One university and asking us, who are the disaster experts, to quote the title of a book that I really like. And so who are the disaster experts?
Right.
And I was just so inspired by that. And I felt like it was my civic duty to step up because I am so inspired by this community. And so I thought, what can I do to like get a boatload of words from those experts? And this is one attempt for that.
I mean, there's something, even describing what you just did, it would have been, and I appreciate the sort of bipartisan way you framed that. And there are people in state houses across the country and municipal, local, county level, who are identify as Republicans and Democrats and independents, non-affiliated, who will be impacted by the leadership that comes out of Washington one way or the other. So I agree with you, and I like the way you framed that, and even what you just said. A year ago, we would have thought it would have been, or 4 years ago. Why would something like this even need to be partisan or political? It's just a transfer of expertise from the research community to the practitioner community and the political community. So I applaud what you're trying to do there. Having said that, maybe you don't have to tell us who you want to be the next FEMA administrator, but what are the qualities that you're looking for in leadership at Health and Human Services, at NOAA, at all of the different agencies? And we think of FEMA first, but we have to also consider the Department of Homeland Security. What are the qualities of leadership that you're looking for there?
Yes. So first, thank you for asking me that and not asking me to name names, but I would like to say this. I heard recently, it was a story about our federal workforce and how many, hundreds of thousands of federal employees there are who are full-time government employees, and then the relatively very small number who are actually political appointees who come and go as the administrations go. And so one thing I want to say in response to that is thank goodness for our government workers and our public servants and the work they do every single day to keep the machinery of our institutions moving forward. And when our institutions are stretched to the limit, may we thank those government workers who, without recognition, without thanks, without acknowledgement, oftentimes continue with the work that they see is going to help to make this a stronger nation. So one thing I want to say about leadership is I think that over these past several years, we've really been able to see on full display the power and the patriotism and the commitment of the everyday civil servants who are members of our federal workforce. Now, in addition, to answer your question, there are obviously these very powerful and important political appointees who come in to lead our major federal agencies that have an influence over all of our lives, from what weather warnings we do or do not receive to whether we get the vaccine or not. And so I think the qualities that I would look for in those political leaders is first and foremost deep expertise in whatever agency that it is that they are set to lead, that they hold expertise in that area, whether it's in Homeland Security and emergency management, Health and Human Services, geological sciences, and so forth. And so I think having deep expertise, having a respect for the institutions that and the people that make those institutions possible, I think is crucially important. Having a respect for government and the role that government plays in all of our lives, and also having a recognition of the immense crises that we're facing right now and the power and the limits that government can play, and hence the role that the rest of us, the private sector, civil society, that we may need to play in helping to make this great experiment that we call the United States actually work.
Well, that's all of that is very well taken, and the parlor game of who's going to be at the head of FEMA, for example, is a never-ending thing. But I think, just to come back to those four themes, there's a lot of work to do. particularly on climate and particularly on all of them, incredibly hardworking workforce in HHS and in FEMA and of course in DHS and all the way, again, in states and localities, taking racial injustice on board and taking climate change on board. I think people who may not be as familiar with this, that is going to be a big sea change in the brief for those agencies. So having this Letters Project underline that is really crucial. And I know the hazards meeting this year, that's really part of the discourse right now among the research community.
Yeah, yes, it absolutely is. And I will say that our federal partners who attend that meeting oftentimes, really remark on how important it is to have that connection to the academic research community. Obviously, there are federal scientists, policymakers, and practitioners who are there, as well as local, state, private sector. And so I think it's that having all the powerful voices in the room, having the minds from the emerging scholars up to the senior scholars and practitioners who've seen it all twice and three times. I think that sort of, I guess I'd add that as a characteristic for our new leaders too, people who are really willing to listen and to consult those who are already out there, but also who are willing to really say, in the face of all the crises that are unfolding, we may need to figure out some new pathways forward.
Okay, so it's the 1000 Letters Project, and you can check that out on the Hazards Center website, and we'll be sure to tweet that out. And just note here, if you want to send the email in, write your letter, make it as PDF, and send it to 1000 letters, 1000 letters at colorado.edu. And Lori Peak will read your letter and pass it along. So, Lori, great project, and as usual, great to speak with you.
Scott, always a pleasure and an honor, and I can't wait to listen to the rest of the show. So thank you so much.
Okay. Happy holidays. Thanks.
Have a great day. Bye.
Okay, and we're going to turn to the next part of our discussion today, and let me introduce my guests for this second part of COVID Calls today. Nalan Azak is a medical anthropologist pursuing a PhD at the Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages at the University of Oslo. Her research explores the local infrastructure and use of antibiotics in Turkey in light of the current antimicrobial resistance problem by drawing on discourses of medical anthropology and the history of public health in Turkey. Erik Isberg is a PhD candidate in the Division of History of Science, Technology and Environment at the KTH Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. He is currently working on a thesis on the history of post-war paleoclimatology and the making of Anthropocene temporalities. This spring, Erik wrote about the times of knowledge production during the pandemic for the Swedish daily Svenska Dagbladet. Emil Flatå is a PhD candidate at the Department of Culture Studies and Oriental Languages in Oslo. His research concerns the interdisciplinary transatlantic network of managers, scientists, and bureaucrats that spawned the traditions for making claims about society and climate's entwined futures. This history of risk management is relevant to the sorts of knowledge politics that have been playing out around the COVID-19 pandemic, especially concerning the shared emphasis on modeled knowledge. Previously, Flatå was a staff writer at Morgenbladet, a Norwegian weekly of arts, science, and politics. And our fourth guest for this segment is Leonor Borgesius, an environmental historian doing a PhD in cultural history at the University of Oslo. She was also a guest researcher at the Division for the History of Science, Technology, and Environment at the KTH in Stockholm. She writes on the history of the imagining, planning, and construction of infrastructure works in the Netherlands and colonial Suriname. She's specifically interested in how these structures invite environmental knowledge, production, and distribution, and carry imaginaries of progress and modernity. So glad to bring these brilliant researchers to COVID Calls. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
As usual, to guests who are well ahead of the East Coast of the United States in time. It's middle of the night there, and Nalan, particularly you, and actually I'll have to start with Nalan. Just tell us where you're calling in from and how the pandemic is there, and thank you for staying up so late.
Thank you, Scott. I'm calling in from Istanbul, Turkey. Currently, there's a curfew in Turkey in the evenings from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. in the mornings and full-time on weekends. The rates are quite high, or they announced the asymptomatic cases as well a few weeks ago. So there is an air of panic. Restaurants have closed down again. Schools have closed. They were open from the beginning of term. Well, some year groups were. But yeah, life is carrying on. People are still out when they can be, and they need to go to work. But yeah, it's that's about it.
Have you been there the balance of the time in the pandemic, or did you travel to Turkey? Were you there doing research? Help me understand your movements through this time.
I arrived on the 1st of October, so it's been a bit over 2 months now. I came to do my field work, and it was going okay. Well, with all the delays, because I'm doing research about antibiotics, so I need access to healthcare institutions, which has been difficult. And I've been at home for the past few weeks as the rates have been increasing. But I'm still happy to be here to be able to observe how the pandemic plays out in everyday life.
This problem of even the concept of field work, which I think for everybody in the kind of research we all do, there was deep despair by May and June that people were going to have to change their dissertation topics. They're going to have to give up on book projects, whatever it was. But you made the decision to go ahead. I mean, I guess the indicators by late summer were maybe you could get some field work done, like real field work, like in the field.
Yes. I did take some courses on how to do field work on Zoom and, going beyond traditional methods. And they have been useful. So I'm even doing some of my interviews here over Zoom now because it's too risky to go in or meet people in person. So I'm kind of doing a bit of both, and I still wanted to be here to see how the pandemic unfolds because I think that's part of my research. It's I can't really leave it out of the questions that I have.
Eric, let's turn to you. Where are you calling from, and what's it looking like there, pandemic-wise?
Yes, I'm calling from Stockholm, Sweden. And just before I came on here, I read that this is literally the darkest December since 1934, with 0 hours of sunlight right now. And I think maybe the situation in terms of the pandemic is perhaps not quite that grim, but it is a very rough situation right now in Sweden, where the second wave has come on quite strongly after sort of slowly rising throughout the fall. So we're seeing a very high number of cases. It seems that it's plateauing right now, but on a very high level. So it's definitely not quite as high as in the spring, but still very high, I think, among the highest rates in Europe right now. So there we are back to restrictions that are actually more strict than in the spring, with a maximum gathering of 8 people. And most people try to work from home if it's possible, and recommended to not socialize with people outside of their household. So it's very much in the midst of the second wave, I think I would summarize it.
What about your own experience of doing research at this time? Have you had to modify your plans for where you might go, and even the kinds of questions you might ask in the work?
Yeah, to a quite high degree, actually, because my PhD project is based partly or to some quite large extent with US sources and US archives. And that has obviously been a quite rough thing to have right now. So I've been trying to sort of perhaps reformulate some questions to look into more Scandinavian contexts. But any kind of archival visits, for example, for an historian has been very hard to conduct. So it's getting more and more theory heavy now, my work. So there's definitely been implications.
You know, one of the things, just to linger on that for a second, there's been so much enthusiasm for the digitization of archives, for historical archives, and of course, great progress made in that. And then all of a sudden, maybe this resonates with you, we really put that to the test starting in March to find out how much truly had been digitized and how much we could get away with not having an expert archivist. In my own experience, I can tell you I haven't gotten very far.
I would share that experience very much. It was yeah, it became very clear to me actually how dependent we are on the material archives, at least in my case.
Thanks, Eric. Emil, let me bring you in on this. Where are you located right now, and how is the pandemic looking there?
I'm located in Oslo, Norway, where it was looking, I guess the fall we were kind of moving like a slow train towards a second wave, and it was looking pretty spooky at a point there. But now we are in lockdown again, but we are past the peak, it looks like. So it seems it's going to be possible to celebrate some kind of a Christmas without putting a lot of people under threat by traveling.
And have you found this to have an impact on your ability to move around, do the kind of work you need to do?
Yeah, my story is basically the exact same as
Really?
Eric. I was going to be in America this year visiting archives, which obviously didn't pan out. As to the question of digitization, I think it would be a very good time to study handwritten manuscripts from Norway in the 1700s or something right now, because the Norwegian National Library is running a very, very ambitious digitization project, and they have been for years. So that's in the clouds, but not the stuff that I need.
Amazing. Well, I guess I can't apologize for my entire country, but I may as well. I can't imagine how many people around the world have had their business, their research disrupted at this time because they just can't get into the United States, or if they do, the facilities they want to use are closed, and we have no way of knowing, because it's, if your research materials are in California or New York, those states have been more aggressive at trying to get things open. But if your research materials are in the American Midwest or the South, it could be an awfully long time before you get access to those things. Leonor, let me bring you in now. Same question, where are you and what's it looking like there?
Hi, I'm also in Oslo. So more or less the same, kind of situation. It has to be said though that a peak in Norway looks very different from a peak in Sweden. So in terms of absolute numbers, it's in no way comparable, which is a very good thing, which makes it, for example, possible for us to come into the office every so often. I recently moved to a new apartment, and it seems like the entire building started to redoing their bathrooms. So I had to negotiate some sort of time with the administration for me to come in. So that's very, really very nice. But in terms of archives and research, I've been I think most of us have been compromised, some more than others. So in my case, I have my research deals primarily with Dutch sources, and most of them are in the Netherlands. I very quickly realized that there would be no way of traveling to South America, which is where the second part of my dissertation research is focused. Suriname, which is it's a very small country in between Guyana and Brazil. So once I realized that I actually needed those archives, that was about like February. So I had to kick out that entire ambition, I guess. But I have been very fortunate when it comes to the digitization efforts of the Dutch Royal Library and the Dutch National Archive. They have a gigantic digital archive that is online, which carries their ambition is to digitize everything that is published in terms of journals, magazines, newspapers. Wow. Up until I think 20 years ago. And it so happens that I found a lot of useful material, which means that I've sort of had to change some source material, and that automatically also leads to like some changes in the questions that we can ask, but it's more than I hoped for. So I'm very, very, I have to send some personal emails, I think, to people who actually pushed for that project, because it's saving us all at this point. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, This is one of those times where if you go back and think about writers and scholars who were working in the Cold War, who were working in World War II and various times, where if you know what you're looking for, you start to piece things together, even if they're not writing about that war or that disaster, that becomes the background of the work that they're writing. And I feel like that's going to be sort of the decoder ring for a lot of the work that we're all producing right now, even if it's not directly about COVID, that imprint will be there. Leonor, I want to stay with you for a second. Part of what we wanted to talk about today was the situation in Scandinavia, and particularly the kinds of cross-border tensions that have come about in this time. Sweden has been in the news, Norway less, in the news in the United States for its approach to the pandemic. I wonder if you could just orient us a little bit to the different approaches that the two countries have taken and the kinds of tensions that have resulted, and then we can open that up to anybody else who wants to talk about it.
Yeah, great. Thanks for that question. I think this question is a very complicated and broad one, and very impactful, and we can probably unpack it in a million different ways. Because so broadly speaking, I think it's safe to say that Norway took a very hands-on approach with quite strict lockdowns very early on in March, whereas Sweden famously took a completely different approach, keeping a lot more open, a lot less measures with a very big death counts as a result. And historically, obviously, and also geographically, these nations are very, very close, and which automatically, obviously, leads to a lot of cross-national relations. And in my case, that's very literal. My partner lives in Stockholm, which normally wouldn't necessarily be difficult because it's 8 hours less if you take a train, 6 hours. I think it's a 1 hour flight or something. And suddenly borders close, which is an incredibly strange experience. It messes with your sense of geography in a very fundamental way, strangely enough. But obviously, this leads to all kinds of tensions because it messes with trade relations. There's famously alcohol is a lot cheaper in Sweden, so Norwegians tend to drive across the border for groceries, and all of these businesses they come to a standstill at this point. It's tense, and I think for many it also came unexpected that these borders suddenly sort of froze up. Yeah.
Let me bring Emil on this and to this question of the surprise of it. Were you surprised that the two countries, Norway and Sweden, took such different approaches? And as it's unfolded, the national discourse about whether or not a country has handled this well or not, I'm sort of interested again in that comparison.
Yeah, I guess, I'm surprised that it's played out in very strange and specific ways. I'm not sure that's the big surprise, but I have been surprised at the, because there's, rivalry between Norway and Sweden is usually a fairly sort of lighthearted thing, we're the baby brother, we like to kind of take a jab every once in a while. But the tenor of the difference in this crisis has become really intense, in Sweden in particular, feeling assailed and making, rustling diplomatic feathers even in terms of long-term relations with the two countries. So I've been surprised at the intensity of the rivalry around it. As to the tactics chosen, I'm not sure that I would have that down to any broader differences between our countries or the cultures, because it seems to have so much to do with the specific way that the pandemic laws are organized in the two countries and the way that expertise for decision making is organized. And I think we could have very easily wound up in the same situation here in Norway as in Sweden. So that's kind of a fluke, or what's the word? Yeah.
But the specific decision to embrace this kind of herd immunity strategy, to your knowledge, I mean, was that ever discussed in Norway, or was that ever thought to be maybe that would be a pan-Scandinavian kind of approach, or that's something uniquely, to this time and place in Sweden's expert culture?
Well, no one will really take the herd immunity word into their mouths, right? It's like it's a dirty word. But I definitely think that the strategy that Anders Tegnell and the Swedish Public Health Authority have chosen has a lot of authority here too. We need to remember that the European, the EU's pandemic response or public health body is located in Stockholm. I think there's a really tight epistemic community there that is also being heard in Norway and has close ties with our public health body. They would deny today that is the strategy that they went for, but I think you can certainly see that they were more sanguine about the possibilities of flattening the curve as opposed to cracking down more resolutely. And my father, who works for the other public health board in Norway, claims that if they weren't around to hand their opinion, their expert opinion to government, they wouldn't have had a different foundation on which to choose a different strategy.
Eric, let's bring you in on this. Anything you want to add to what's been said so far about the approaches of the two different countries?
Yeah, no, but I think there's a lot of truth to what Emil and Leonor just said, that these strategies has panned out very differently, but with very sort of minor technical things leading to that outcome. I think there's really something to more of how the state authorities are organized in the respective countries. And then in Sweden, we have these very strong independent state authorities that can do a lot without the government intervening. So there was really this small group of experts, with Anders Tegnell, the state epidemiologist, becoming the sort of phase 4 that got a lot of say in this, whereas the politicians were not that involved, contrary to Norway, where I think Anders Tegnell, for example, knows all these experts in Norway. I think there's a very close-knit community, but it's more of the kind of role they get in how much say they get in the policy. So I think that would be rather the kind of starting point for these vastly different strategies, but they started out in this kind of small group that's it's not really, I think, founded in deep cultural differences. But then I think this has set in motion all these different kinds of things between the two countries that has been quite interesting to follow, I think, in terms of Sweden-Norway relations. But I think the origins of it is really quite sort of part of the governance structures of the countries.
Eric, there was a article that was a front page article in the late spring in the New York Times. The Times has covered a lot of what has been going on in Sweden. And of course, in the United States, we think if you make it to the cover of the New York Times, then that's global news, right? That's a particularly American perspective. Let me put a pin in that. Nevertheless, it does seem that American attention, particularly American media attention to what came to be seen as Swedish missteps, started to jangle the nerves in Swedish government, and with deeper concerns that it might be damaging Swedish brands, investment, that would have ripple effects that go well beyond the pandemic. And this pandemic is not just physical, a biological thing. It's also an economic issue as well. I wonder if you could give me a little feedback on your take on that. Is that just Americans thinking that something is important when we say it is on the cover of the front page of the New York Times, or is there something deeper at work there about the perception of how the rest of the world is seeing what's going on in Sweden?
Yeah, no, I think definitely. Maybe not, as you say, not particularly that New York Times article, but I mean, Sweden was at least was my perception in Sweden, that there was a lot of discussions in many countries. And I think definitely Sweden is a small country that takes we're very sort of sensitive to what the world thinks of us. It's a big debate in Swedish politics, even before the pandemic. It can concern other issues, the way we talk about how does the rest of the world perceive us, and perhaps mostly the US then. So I think definitely that was the case. And I think also it's notable now during the second wave now in the fall, the government has taken a much more hands-on approach. And there has been a kind of transfer of power from the state authorities to the government. And I think now when we're approaching Christmas, I think the Swedish and Norwegian regulations are very similar actually in the end. So there's definitely been a kind of awareness from the Swedish side, as I've interpreted it, to sort of push more for a government, more kind of the same framework as other Scandinavian countries, but much later then.
Right. I just wanted to say that there was one thing I remembered in terms of whether there have been cultural stories about what's been going on. I think a lot of Norwegians were surprised to see the Swedes not resist more when one expert community was taking completely insane decisions. And actually, they kind of rallied around him. You know, there were reports of people tattooing Anders Tegnell on their on themselves and stuff. And I think, you know, especially in these last years when you know, intersectional politics have had a lot more sway in Sweden than in Norway. There's been the different refugee politics. There's been a very strong story in Norway about, you know, this very strong authoritarian culture of political correctness as opposed to the kind of ragged peasant Norwegian. And I think the Swedish pandemic response really played into those narratives here in Norway.
Let's bring Nalan into the conversation if you want to comment on anything that has been said, but also maybe we can broaden the geography a little bit outside of Scandinavia and talk about, from your perspective, the degree to which the pandemic has exacerbated existing tensions, or maybe drawn expert communities together. I've seen less about that, but I'm really interested in that aspect of this as well.
Do you mean between Turkey and
Sure.
other countries? Well, I remember the UK not having enough equipment and protective gear, and Turkey sending some equipment to the UK and being very proud over this in the first few months. But otherwise, the response to the pandemic has been late in Turkey as well. It wasn't announced until the 12th of March. And with the experts, I mean, it hasn't really been great in Turkey either in terms of revealing the real numbers or doing enough testing. But people have been encouraged to wear masks. Well, it's compulsory to wear masks in public since the first corona case was announced. And I think one reason why Turkey did well, relatively okay-ish, is due to the high number of ICU beds. That's one of the factors. But still, now there's this conversation about the vaccine, and they don't have the equipment to store or transport and store the vaccines from Europe. So they're now importing vaccines from China, and they're going to test them first before it's given out to the
Nalan,
public.
could you say a little bit more too about you were telling us about coming to Istanbul to do your field work, but a little bit more just about the sort of medical expert community that you're engaged with there, and particularly around issues like fatigue, problems of being heard in policymaking circles. What are some of the frustrations that you're witnessing right now?
There are some very big frustrations, especially because there have been a lot of healthcare staff dying from COVID, and it's not accounted for as a fatality caused by their profession. And so there has been a lot of doctors speaking up about this and wanting to be heard. There is a lot of fatigue, especially with families. I was having one interview with a doctor over Zoom a few weeks ago, and he was wearing a mask over Zoom, which really surprised me. And it turns out he was someone tested positive at his clinic, so he had to wear masks at home as well. So there is an extreme amount of fatigue, and a lot of general practices say they don't know much about the medications being given out, the advice, so they don't feel informed enough to guide their patients when they call them. So yeah, there is a lot of lack of information, a lot of uncertainty, and lack of support.
One of the real challenges that we've seen, I think this is a global issue, is how to frame the pandemic as we understand it's a pandemic, so by definition, it's a global phenomena, but it's being dealt with at national and subnational levels. And I want to ask everybody about this, and maybe Nilan, I'll start with you. The extent to which you've seen the discourse around the pandemic response sort of talk about something that's inherently Turkish. There's something about the state. There's something unique about ethnicity, perhaps, that gives people strength. Or maybe the other side, that you would argue, and we've heard this in the United States, that there are fundamental flaws in American culture that have actually led us to have really grievous inequalities. It's racism in this country. That's the story about COVID, one of the many stories. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that from the Turkish perspective. To what extent is there a such thing as a Turkish response to disaster?
Well, at the beginning of this, there was a very funny discourse. So because Turkey was so delayed in announcing the first case, that there was this idea of the corona don't hit the Turks. It's like a genetic thing. And then there was another one saying, Turkish people are very clean. They so they won't get the virus. But of course, as time revealed, it didn't turn out to be so. But still, you also see it in discourses of the medication. For instance, they say, we will invent a local medication for this. We will invent a Turkish vaccine in the coming months. So there is that kind of discourse coming along. And also in terms of immunity and immunity boosting medicines and foods. So you see a lot of the medication going along with Turkish local products, vinegar and garlic and all the rest of it.
I'd like to turn that same question, Emil. Let me bring you in on that. Is there something inherently Norwegian about the response? Is it given rise to some sort of enhanced nationalism, something about national character, or beyond that, racial character?
At least national character. I hope it's limited to that, but I don't know. It's actually funny because we wrote a couple of weeks ago, all of us, right? And I was saying that they were just bringing out the term annerledeslandet, which means the different country, which is a trope of Norwegian exceptionalism that most recently it's been aired with respect to the financial crisis that kind of hit all of Europe, but not Norway because we're an oil country. And very quickly they started bringing that out when it looked like there wouldn't be a second wave in Norway. But since I haven't heard it being used anymore. The second big national trope that's been brought out is dugnadsånd. So the idea that we're a particularly public spirited nation who come together and rally. Which I think, I would assume most countries have a similar way of talking. So the exceptionalism to it doesn't quite bear out. But I do think that what it does speak to, and I think you saw this in Sweden as well, is that especially in these really homogenous countries, right, there can be a tendency that, and you also have sort of well-functioning political institutions, but they are very tied to the majority population and this kind of superstructure of a cultural story that the institutions use to then bring out their politics doesn't quite work once you go beyond the perimeter of who's covered by the term. So both in Sweden and Norway, I think the term they're using right now is foreign-born populations have been more severely hit, which tells you something about the policies not quite reaching.
I was looking at a news article published in Sweden back in May, and it was sort of early kinds of stories. You saw these in lots of countries saying, here are the particularly at-risk populations. And it said, and it used this kind of very inexact language about people who were not Swedish somehow. And I'd have to, and it seemed like the article was hedging. It was men who were, who had low income and people who were from outside of the country, but didn't go much further than that into describing the nature of really what they were talking about here. So I guess I want to sort of get your take on what Emil is talking about and Ilana's talking about, the degree to which there's been a discourse about what it means to be Swedish and not Swedish in this time, and how that refracts, I think this is where Emil was going, on immigration and on the plurality of the society.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question. And I think this has been very clear in the kind of Swedish, kind of the evolution of different kind of Swedish identities in this like, as the pandemic has been progressing. Because I think as Nalan said here, there's been a kind of multiple discourses in a way of what would be the Swedish approach to this. And I think it started out in this kind of odd place, at least I found, and I remember Leonor and I talked about it when Leonor was here in Stockholm, this notion of Swedes would not need any tough regulations because this was kind of national exceptionalist, sort of very norm-abiding, very follow, we just need a recommendation, we don't need rules, and it was a kind of national, we have such trust in our experts, etc., etc. And that, of course, once the pandemic started to sort of get out of hand during the spring, was a hard narrative to maintain. And there, I think also these kind of the communities that got very disproportionately hit, in for example, some suburbs in Stockholm with a high degree of immigrants as part of the population that was hit very, very badly. And then that narrative started to sort of fall apart, because what were you supposed to do with it, in a sense? Because it was obvious that there were socioeconomic factors here at play that can't be really, if people are working and can't work from home because you have a job where you have to go to your workplace, for example, or you live a lot of people in a small apartment because you can't afford a bigger one. And then you can't really put that on kind of the rational quality of the Swedes. So it sort of fell apart when, as Emil said, this kind of superstructure of thinking about what this meant, and then the kind of material reality, when those two narratives did not really work out in any cohesive way. And I think that really came across very strongly in Sweden as the pandemic unfolded and still is unfolding.
Leonor, I want to ask you too, but can we talk about the Netherlands in this regard too? I mean, another country that somehow discovered some aspects of national identity which might often be tamped down but emerge in the midst of the pandemic?
Yeah, for sure. I think, sadly enough, this narrative of a sort of strong sense of nationality, or even, I go so far as to call it a sort of ethnically defined nationality, as opposed to those with what in the Netherlands they call a migrant background. That's the politically correct way to call this now. This was definitely going on, and still is going on in the Netherlands as well. So they were fairly late in announcing measures, and when they did also these measures, like there was a lot of discussion out in the open of what kind of measures and how far reaching should they be. Should the schools open or not? Should they close? And this I think it was then also explained, this kind of discussion in itself is explained as being typically Dutch. So the Dutch are notorious for having this political culture of discussion, of debate, of lots of talking, and then finding a compromise that then does work, but also lacks like actual, sometimes very necessary action. And there's a lot of research on why this is the case. It supposedly had to do with its environmental history with water management, which required a lot of collaboration for centuries, basically. At least, so that's the story. So there was a lot of sort of, from the politicians or from sort of government, there was a call upon this this level-headedness, and we will discuss and we will talk and we will have another committee and then another committee making research and reports into this, and then we'll take decisions. With the result that indeed, for example, with the testing capacity, it's a very profound example. It was eventually scaled up, but not too much, not enough, and too late. And it still isn't quite where it's supposed to be, or where it should be. So it had quite profound consequences, and then the whole narrative of immigrants being responsible for this it's been there all along, including headlines that say statistically, right, it's mostly people who have a migrant background that are at risk, without actually addressing the socioeconomical circumstances of why that is the case. So I think it's safe to say that in most European countries, they fall back on a certain sort of national self-understanding to explain their policy, and simultaneously there are also very similar tendencies with regards to a sort of a darker side of nationalism. Islamophobia is very, very much rampant in the Netherlands, for example, and those they're on the rise, very much, very much so, I would say.
It's what you're describing too it's been a Rorschach test probably everywhere, certainly in the United States, that when you present what seems to be quite obvious epidemiological findings, that people in the United States who come from minority communities are experiencing inequality in terms of infection rates and death, I think the majority of Americans look at that and they say, oh, well, then we have to address inequality. But there's always that segment of society, and unfortunately here it's been a growing segment, that's taken the opposite approach and said, oh, well, then we have a problem with minorities in this country. And that sort of that I think we see that across, we see that in Brazil, we've seen that in, I think, anywhere in the world where we've been able to sort of follow these kinds of discourses. And I don't think we have the luxury of discounting them as aberrant. I mean, I think that's one of the features of this time, and what this pandemic is exposing is a consistent space for xenophobic and right-wing voices to make a case which echoes back to eugenics and things that a lot of us have thought we'd heard the last of, and maybe naively. So, Emil, I don't know, you want to come in on this or anything else we've been talking about?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I also think there's something about how this is being mediatized that will really feed into that, right? We've seen here a couple of examples of, there was a so-called super spreader event at a Muslim wedding out in a municipality in the districts, which got a lot of xenophobic attention. There's something about the way that it became about the rituals, and it was very ugly. But what I actually wanted to ask you guys was whether you think that the pandemic is perhaps changing perceptions or ways that governments in Europe are responding to matters of ethnic-based inequities. Because I know that in Norway, seeing that we have a public health crisis that is hitting so differentially in terms of ethnicity, and that we're really failing in certain communities and also to reach out, and you've actually had sort of, for instance, in the Somali community, it's been a volunteer-based thing for people in the community to go together and make sure that information is communicated well. I think that's a bit of a shock to a country that is that's so used to thinking of itself as well managed. And I heard just today that the government has gotten savvier about who they're consulting with in terms of reaching out to different communities that don't speak the language. Before they would go to these big umbrella organizations, now they're actually they've gotten more informed about who's actually working on these issues on the ground. So that was a glimmer of hope to me. I wonder if you guys have seen similar things.
Yeah, maybe I could say something to that from a Swedish perspective, that I think that has been very evident in Sweden as well, and sort of very much a late, sort of noticing that too late that this was an issue. that also perhaps comes from the kind of narrow expert culture that has been sort of leading the kind of the ambition to navigate in this pandemic, that it's been a kind of clear sense that this knowledge has occurred very late, that how to sort of reach out to different communities and how to have these kind of more nuanced understanding of society, that I think these kind of national myths has been very present even among the experts themselves, the medical expertise, that this has not really been an issue, at least in my perception, that has been very strongly felt in that community, but it's sort of now sort of stumbling across it as a bit late. And I think that has been very present in Sweden as well. So definitely some kind of hope, but also a bit of a frustration, because I think there is a lot of expertise already out there among different communities and among scholars, among all these kinds of different groups that could have already been part of those conversations and at a much earlier stage, in a sense.
Leonor, did you want to come in on that, or Nilan?
Yeah, just real quick. I think for the Dutch perspective, there is increasing attention, especially from the public, actually, for systemic racism and specifically anti-Black racism, because the Dutch have a very profound history and long history of slavery, and this discussion has been increasingly present, luckily. And what is less so critically examined is very profound rising Islamophobia, which is indeed it's very profound. Like, you can see it very much in there's all kinds of statistics on this, how people with for example, there's a big Moroccan community. People with Moroccan sounding names have a profound disadvantage on the housing market, on the job market. They are, this is a recent scandal, the tax office is examining them more, and more, and they're under more scrutiny in that department. So there's increasing public debate, but there is very little action from government institutions to do something about it, to put it bluntly. Which is no surprise with the center right-wing government. That's how it is.
Just want to remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls, and we're talking about Scandinavia and the rest of Europe and Turkey and the pandemic. And I want to ask a sort of a broad question and see where it intersects each of your thinking at this time. I know you all think about the environment broadly and about the history of the environment and about the Anthropocene, which is a term that we use more and more to describe this period of time of global change as one that's been wrought by human activity. And, I've been very struck, and I actually got to talk with Dipesh Chakrabarty about this earlier on in the spring. I've been struck by the real usefulness of those concepts in this time, frankly. That to understand COVID-19, you had to really be thinking about planetary scale changes that went well beyond the virus. And also, though, to be thinking about the ways that the response, and this is when I'm sort of puzzling this part still, because there's been a lot of frustration, rightly so, with the sort of idea that there could be a global response to climate change, for example. And the global governmental structures that we've set up are quite good at gathering knowledge and not as good at framing policy. And in the midst of that despair, a good chunk of the world in the springtime went on lockdown. It was a massive collective action. And so I'm kind of, my inherent pessimism was tempered a little bit in the spring. And I'm not quite sure what to make of that. And maybe that's an aberrant moment as we look back on this pandemic in its totality. Maybe we'll look back and say, well, that was sort of born of fear or of uncertainty and not so much out of collective action. But that's one of the dimensions of this that's been on my mind. And I ask this question to each of you because I know you think about it both in a contemporary sense and a historical and a perspective. But what do you think that these broader temporalities do for us in this time? And I want to ask something connected with that, if you want to take it on, which is how do we translate that kind of thinking into policy language that policymakers can actually pick up? because so much of our disaster response is very much in the moment. It's about the disaster as a happening right now. We're going to deal with it in the now. And it doesn't leave space for this broader thinking. I guess what I've just described is less a question and more just a field of inquiry. But I sort of know, I'd like to know where your thinking is on this. Emil, let me start with you on this.
Well, I just think, you know, for me, it was such a weird experience to be studying the terms of climate futurity, which is, you know, has such a weird, you know, it's a really extended temporality, and it's not really located where the time of decision making really is. So it was really weird to see what I could recognize as terms from those debates, or for other risk debates, happening in a so much more concrete situation. And I thought, you know, this spring I was looking at the Norwegian response. I was looking at these competing expert views, and basically talking about how the sort of precautionary principle was being sidelined in favor of this idea that the models were actually necessary for a proper response, because we are now able to see things down the road that we can't disregard, right? That, like, the idea that if you didn't build herd immunity, for instance, you would have, you know, it would hit you like a boomerang. But I'm really, the importance of the time of action and the period in which sort of all of society is in lockdown, and just how much that changes has really been brought home to me. And I think you can really see that the more resolute the action was in the first place, and the more completely the risk was clamped down on, the better they have fared now in the second wave, right? So really moving from this kind of debate about how do we handle uncertainty to the importance of the actual moment that government takes action.
Eric, can I get your perspective on this?
Yeah, no, I think Emil points to something really important here, which is this kind of reliance on prediction and modeling. And I think that's also so much present. I mean, it's the kind of most present thing, perhaps, with the IPCC reports and these constant prognostications, that now we got to see all of this in a kind of fast speed. We see all of this unfold in real time. And I think particularly perhaps the Sweden-Norway case of how do you prognosticate, for example, a second wave? How fast will it, boomerang come back at you? How will you bet on different things in different scenarios? And all these things that are sort of slowly being kind of this action that should perhaps be taken in terms of the climate issue, but is sort of slowly proceeding with a kind of non-action like unfolding. Now, in this case, we got to see it all as kind of, as in a weird sense, just watching how do these prognostications, how are they valued? What are these like forms of different futures? How do they compete? Who gets to say what? What are these expert cultures that then informs politicians, that then informs societies in these really interesting, complex ways? And it happened just so fast, just a couple of months, and then it was all changed again. And it was, I think that would be a way of thinking more as a kind of a scholarly perspective. I think a huge resource thinking about kind of climate expertise and all these different things, because this is very similar in so many ways in terms of the planetary scope and the kind of deep impact on so many people. So I think it was very interesting to see just how these things unfolded so rapidly. And I think there's a lot of things to sort of take with us from that, going into these deeper, longer temporalities of sort of Anthropocene present.
Let me, Nilan, let me bring you in on this and ask it as in slightly different variety of this question, which has to do with the public health aspect of this, because a lot of the way that we talk about public health is also resonant here. I mean, you have the pandemic, but it's of course understood against a backdrop of sort of broader health, access to healthcare, the persistent comorbidities in the society, even the research that you're doing, sort of persistent health issues that are there, and trying to understand the one in the relation to the other is a real challenge for expert communities often. How do we understand the pandemic against the broader health background of Turkey or any other country? I wonder how that comes up in the work you've been doing. I guess it's really a question about, ultimately, how do we define some line between what's a disaster and what's just sort of everyday life in the Anthropocene or everyday life in climate change?
Yes, they did, of course, had to take some other action in terms of managing managing other conditions and diseases and medication prescriptions. So because I've been looking more at the prescriptions and the medications that have been used, some have been, some certain conditions have been moved on to automatic prescriptions, so people don't have to go in and see their doctor before they get their prescriptions, for instance. But also in terms of access to healthcare and the socioeconomic conditions, that has also played out, where there are a lot of like private and public hospitals in Turkey, and especially in Istanbul. So people have been going into these hospitals to get tested, and some private hospitals have been doing a lot of extra tests, and they've had these COVID packages charging people 3 or 4 folds more than the COVID test. So they've had to put a limit on those. So there has been a lot of things. And also psychologically, I've heard this from a lot of people, how mental health has been not been, people have been doing quite bad when it comes to mental health, especially the elderly, because they've been stuck at home, not being able to see people. So yeah, I mean, there are, this list can probably go on.
No, and just to stay with that, because you
yeah.
have the unique perspective of a person who can see this through, as an expert, through the Scandinavian perspective, but also the Turkish perspective. Do you see some cultural differences there in the way that sort of long-term uncertainties and risks are perceived? And I also recognize I'm asking you to somehow essentialize Turkey and Scandinavia. So I don't mean to do that necessarily, but I am interested in some, because at this time, as we were talking earlier, there are these attempts to kind of try to unify what a country's response is or what a country's thinking is. And that's reflected through policy, but also through culture. That comparability must be interesting to you. I'm wondering if you can reflect on that a little bit.
I think the priorities and uncertainties are quite different when you compare the different countries. So like I said, the shops have been open and even restaurants for a while to keep the economy going. And people don't really have the luxury to stay at home, although there have been calls to stay at home, other than the middle or higher class who can afford to do that. So, and there have been homeschooling, but again, it's very difficult for a family of more than 1 or 2 children to have access to laptops, and for parents to be able to be at home to help them work out the technology and make sure that they actually sit in front of the screen. This has been a problem across Europe as well, not only Turkey. But if a mother or father needs to go out to work and they don't have sick leave if they get ill, there are of course a lot of different priorities there.
Leonor, let me bring you in on this issue of the Anthropocene.
Yeah, I think for us as scholars who all and we all deal with science or the role or the work that science does in one way or the other, mostly critically, and from a sort of social or some kind of constructivist perspective, I guess. For us, it was always clear that climate change, there was an issue with translating what the issue actually is into something that is comprehensible by anyone that doesn't deal with this on a professional level, right? And I think what I could tell in my sort of personal surroundings and also in sort of newspapers, media, the public debate is that many people started to make this connection or this comparison between COVID and climate change in 2 sort of very specific ways. The first is that like the decisions or the temporalities of the decisions that are made are kind of locked in. So you make a decision and then it's supposed to help, but there's no way of knowing it until you're 2 or 3 weeks down the line. And that has to do with the other thing, which is that it's a threat that is invisible. It's not there, so we need, or it's not visually there, so we need some kind of mediation to translate the very existence of this thing into something that is there. So eventually what we deal with as a broader public, unless someone in your surrounding really falls ill or passes away, we rely on media to pass this on for us. And I was quite happily surprised that I could see a lot of these kind of discussions unfolding and sort of making it into the newspaper in op-eds of all sorts. So in that sense, I think there's definitely something, or a sort of positive push in that direction in terms of awareness.
Just want to remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls. We're talking with Emil Flatto, Leonor Borgesius, Nalan Azak, and Eric Isberg today about COVID-19 in Scandinavia, in Turkey, and the rest of Europe. We're almost up on time, and it is getting late, very late now where you are, but I wanted to get one more question in, and maybe, Leonor, I'll start with you and then see what others want to say about this. I was in high school in 1989 when the wall came down, and it was, of course, it was important in the United States, but not felt the way it was felt in Europe. I think you are all, probably it's fair to say, a sort of a post-1989 generation, and the enthusiasms the world has channeled looking at Europe, and within Europe, very broadly defined, have been profound. Enthusiasm for sort of wall smashing, unification, putting fascism and the memory of fascism in light and then away. And now we're in a time of migrant crisis, Brexit, and now this pandemic, with the many uncertainties that you've all been talking about, and the enforcement of a border between countries where even 2 years ago you might have thought it was impossible to imagine a border being enforced. I don't want to make this a binary choice, Leonor, that you have to say things are getting better or getting worse, but I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on that. And maybe even the way I framed it is a little too American and too simple, but I'm curious because it does seem like a time in which some of the old tensions are back.
Yeah, I don't think it's a very bold statement to say that they are. Discussions of anti-Semitism are really, I mean, they're very much there. Islamophobia, racism, it's very much it's very much popping up in places where it was more normal to call it out, or it's occupying the discourse in a quite worrying way. I feel. I was actually born in 1989. So I think what struck me very much so about the crisis and the issue of borders is that I was brought up in a Europe without borders. I don't think I ever had the experience of crossing a border until I came to the United States for the first time when I was 14, I think. And I mean, obviously, we have to talk about as well about how privilege plays into this, right? Like, sort of European white upper middle class, highly educated. But that's precisely also the point, that the Schengen area is one of the many things of the European project that promises this sort of cosmopolitan European citizen, right? And it exists out of the ECTS point system, the Erasmus program, cheap flights within Europe, railways, station, the mobility of labor. So I think for many of us, especially internationally young researchers, Europe exists as this sort of homogeneous space in which you can move around freely, and this is how you organize your life. And then suddenly, without any warning, the rules are changed. and that does something very sort of disillusionary to the very trust in the fact that borders they're just a formality within Europe, I'm saying, right? And this sort of this pushback or the revival of national borders coincides with an already existing tendency of upcoming right-wing nationalism that becomes this sort of very toxic cocktail of this almost perfect storm that I think what we've seen in the UK with Brexit is a perfect example of what can happen there.
Let me bring Milan in on that.
Yeah, just shortly, I was living in the UK when Brexit hit, and so I'm a Danish citizen, and suddenly we had to just think about, so what do we do? So, suddenly everything just changed. What's going to happen now to our rights? Can we stay here? Can we work here? Do we pay the same tuition fees? So we had to go through another extra bureaucratic process as a family. But there are a lot of people who are not as fortunate and who are struggling, and there are a lot of uncertainties ahead of them. But thank you, Leonor. I think you kind of touched on some very important points, and I agree.
Emil, can I get your perspective on this, or anything else that we left hanging earlier in the conversation that you wanted to hone in on?
Well, I think maybe, I'm from Oslo, which is not a big city, but it is a putatively cosmopolitan city. So I feel like I was raised as part of this kind of borderless community that, so many of my friends studied abroad and didn't really think of ourselves as a region. And I think the good part that has come out of the changes that have happened in the last couple of years is that the idea of home has resurfaced, and also that it's playing out in Norway. Xenophobia is kind of like the last big wave of populism here. Now it's more about decentralization and the importance of, Norway's a huge country, right? And keeping all the small places alive. So I don't necessarily mourn that if nowhereism is dying, but I am afraid.
Eric, let me give you the last word on this.
Yeah, I think Leonor really summed it up very, very succinct there, with like how these different crises in Europe sort of comes out on top of each other, in a sense that this strengthening nationalism and COVID has really also self-reinforced certain structures that were already there, that there was already a tendency to sort of strengthen borders. And I lived close to the border to Copenhagen. I lived in Malmö in southern Sweden, right next to the border to Denmark. And during the refugee crisis, that was a very sort of symbolic, I think, moment, was the bridge that was built between Malmö and Copenhagen in 2000 as this great testament to the kind of post-1989 order and Sweden connecting to the continent. Mm-hmm. And they put up all these huge fences on the bridge to sort of and stopped everyone and checked for passports in this Swedish police as a huge, like a very sort of militaristic show of force in a way in this very symbolic bridge, and that really that was 5 years ago now. So I think that kind of tendency has come, and it seems like it's with COVID, a similar things has happened again, but in a different way. So I think what Leonor said there, that there are definitely multiple things unfolding and affecting each other in the same time.
I want to remind everyone that you've been listening to COVID Calls, and you can catch COVID Calls every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking with Laura Helmuth, the editor of Scientific American. And I want to thank my guests today for this really rich and sprawling, in a good way, conversation. Emil Flatow, Leonor Borgesius, Milan Izak, and Eric Hisberg. Thanks a million for your time tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks for the invitation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay healthy, everyone, and we'll see you right back here at 5 o'clock tomorrow. Thanks.